The year was 1876, and autumn was clinging to Dry Lantern Ridge with a brittle grip. The high desert air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of alkali dust and the promise of a hard frost. For Sable Heart, the air just tasted of exhaustion. She rode Cinder, her sorrel mare, onto the low slope that led to the Copperfinch Ranch. The last 48 hours had been spent pushing the thin remainder of her herd through the salt juniper basin, a treacherous maze of dry arroyos and thorny scrub. The cattle were delivered, the pay less than she'd hoped. Barely enough to notice was a tight roll in her saddlebag. Now, there was only the ride home. The mare's sweat had dried in stiff patches on her coat, matching the grime on Sable's own skin. Red dust, the stubborn blood of the New Mexico territory, coated her canvas trousers, her boots, and the deep lines of fatigue around her eyes. She was a solitary figure in a landscape that punished solitude. The Copperfinch Ranch had been her father's, and now, by God and stubbornness, it was hers. She dismounted not at the stables, but at the porch of the main house. The long stretch of pine planking was her threshold, and crossing it was the only ritual she allowed herself. Her boots hit the wood. The spurs, dull silver and worn smooth, clanged softly with each step. It was a lonely sound, the only sound accompanying the sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods lining the dry creek bed. Sable pulled the pins from her hair, letting the heavy, dark mass fall, thick with dust. She rolled her shoulders, the muscles screaming from the long hours in the saddle. She had pushed hard, raced the sun, not just to deliver the steers, but to get back. A stillness had settled over Dry Lantern Ridge in the last week, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. She had felt it when she passed through the town an hour prior. Dry Lantern Ridge was little more than a single dusty street carved between the Mercantile, the saloon, the smithy, and the new imposing brick facade of Horace Keeler's bank. The air in town had been thick. News traveled faster than a telegraph in the territory, and the latest news was that Keeler, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, was calling in notes. He was planning a wave of foreclosures, aimed squarely at the smaller ranches struggling after 2 seasons of drought. Sable Heart was struggling. As she rode Cinder down the main street, the town had watched her. She felt the eyes. A curtain shifted in the assayer's office. 2 men talking outside the Mercantile abruptly stopped, turning to watch her pass, their expressions flat and unreadable. They did not tip their hats. She kept her chin up, her gaze steady, her face a mask of calm indifference she had perfected since her father's passing. Her eyes, the color of wet limestone, missed nothing. She noted the drawn blinds on windows that were usually open. She noted the absence of children playing near the water trough. The town was bracing. Inside the Mesquite Ferry Saloon, a place Sable never entered, the air was thick with smoke and cheap whiskey. Vetch Kincaid, a bounty hunter who favored greasy buckskins and boasted of kills he'd never made, was holding court. He slapped a piece of paper down on the bar, smoothing it with a dirty palm. "This one's special," Kincaid announced, his voice raspy. "Banker Keeler himself posted the bounty, $500. A hush fell over the few patrons. 500 was a fortune. "Who's the target?" asked the barkeep, wiping a glass. Kincaid grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "That's the beauty of it. The paper's got no name." He tapped the sheet. It was a warrant, official enough, but the line for the accused was blank. Below it, a description was crudely written in block letters, "Wanted for arson." A woman, tall, dark hair, known to ride a sorrel mare, last seen near Gravel Ford, where she left a burn mark on the old relay station. One of the men squinted. "That ain't much to go on." "Vetch, a woman." "It's enough," Kincaid said, folding the paper carefully. "There ain't that many women running their own spreads out here, and fewer still who wear a gray-ash coat like the one described." At a small table in the corner, Beckett Hale pushed his chair back, the legs scraping the floor. The sound was quiet, but it drew Kincaid's attention. Beckett was new to the ridge, an ex-cavalryman who'd traded his saber for a surveyor's transit. He was quiet, methodical, and kept to himself, charting boundary lines for homesteaders and ranchers. "Something on your mind," Surveyor Kincaid sneered. Beckett stood to his full height. He was lean, but the time in the service hadn't left him. He looked at Kincaid, his gaze level, just wondering how a man collects a bounty on a piece of paper with no name. "You let me worry about that," Kincaid snapped. "Once Keeler confirms the target, he'll have the sheriff fill in the name right quick." Beckett nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the window. He'd seen Sable Hart ride past not 10 minutes before, sitting her horse with the straight-backed posture of a soldier, her gray-ash duster flapping in the wind. He had been charting the boundaries of the Copper Finch last month, arguing with her over a disputed creek bed. He remembered the unique, double-looped rigging on her harness, a field repair so specific he'd almost commented on it. He'd seen that same rigging on a horse tied up near Gravel Ford 3 days ago, the day of the supposed fire. He turned back to the bar, laying a few coins down. "Just seems like a flimsy rope to hang a person with." "Kincaid, but it's your neck." He walked out of the saloon, leaving the bounty hunter staring after him, the seed of doubt planted. Beckett knew exactly who the warrant was for, and he knew it was a setup. Sable knew none of this as she unlatched her porch gate. All she knew was the profound relief of home, but the relief shattered instantly. The feed shed, the heavy wooden door, which she had barred herself before leaving for the basin, stood open by a foot. Her hand moved, instinctive and fast, dropping to the Colt revolver holstered on her hip. She did not draw it, but her fingers rested on the grip. She scanned the ranch yard. Empty. The sun was dipping below the mesas, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange. Long shadows stretched like grasping fingers across the yard. She moved off the porch, her spurs silent now in the thick dust. She approached the shed low and fast, using the water trough for cover before darting to the door and pushing it wide. Empty. Sacks of feed were piled neatly, harnesses hung on their pegs. But on the ground, in the spill of light from the doorway, was the proof: mud. It was damp by the trough, and the intruder had stepped in it, a clear print of a shod hoof, angled sharply, driven deep. It was not the mark of her own horses. It was not the print of her cattle. It was a stranger's boot, and the mud had been tracked in from the yard, and then back out. Someone had been inside while she was gone. Her heart, which had been beating with slow fatigue, now hammered a cold, fast rhythm against her ribs. She backed out of the shed, scanning the property. Nothing. She hurried into the ranch house. The main room was still exactly as she'd left it. The kitchen was cold. She moved past the hearth to the small room her father had used as an office. It held his desk, his chair, and in the corner, a heavy wooden safe, bound in iron. She knelt. The key was still hidden under the loose floorboard where she always kept it. She retrieved it, her hands steady, and unlocked the safe. The cash box was there, untouched. Her father's pocket watch was there, but the brand ledger, the thick, leather-bound book that held the history and proof of every head of cattle marked with the Copperfinch brand, was not in its usual place. It was lying open on the desk. Her blood ran cold. Someone had not been here to steal money. They had been here to look at her records. The book was open to the page documenting the CF brand, its registration, and the tallies from the last 5 years. Someone was verifying her holdings, or worse, looking for a way to dispute them. She felt a violation deeper than theft. They had touched her father's legacy. Her eyes scanned the cluttered desk. Her father's old grazing maps were piled in the corner, tucked just inside the edge of the top map. A map of the very basin she had just returned from was a small, folded piece of paper that did not belong. It was cheap, thin paper, torn from a telegrapher's pad. She unfolded it. 6 characters were written on it, stark and black, KRN, a hyphen, 2, 7, KRN 27. It meant nothing to her. A ledger number, a code. She turned it over. Nothing. She held it to the light. It was just paper, but it felt heavy, dangerous. She carefully folded it and slipped it into the pocket of her shirt, the coarse fabric scratching her skin. She stood very still in the cooling office, the silence of the house pressing in. She was piecing it together. The bank, the foreclosures, the nameless warrant in town, the stranger in her feed shed, the snooping in her brand ledger, and then, faint but clear on the autumn wind, she heard it. The long, mournful cry of a train whistle, echoing down from the pass. Sable closed her eyes. The evening train, the one that carried mail, passengers, and sometimes prisoners under guard. It would be stopping at the Ash Mesa depot in an hour. It was all happening too fast. The warrant, the snooping, the train. It was a trap, designed to snap shut the moment she returned, if someone wanted to frame her, to put her on that train and out of Keeler's way. Tonight was the night. The spurs clanged softly as she walked to the window, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the darkening ridge. They thought because she was alone. She was weak. She would have to prove them wrong. The train whistle faded, leaving a silence in the ranch house so deep it felt like a weight. Sable Hart stood in the dark office, the small, dangerous piece of telegraph paper. KRN 27 clutched in her hand, the mud in the feed shed, the open brand ledger, the train. It was a closing fist. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury a lone woman in the New Mexico territory could not afford. Instead, a cold, methodical anger settled over her. She lit a lantern. The flame cast long, dancing shadows as she returned to the feed shed, her spurs now muffled by the deliberate, hunting quiet of her steps. She held the lantern low, examining the boot print again. A man's, size 10 perhaps, wearing a worn heel. He had come from the direction of the stable and bunkhouse. She followed the trail. The intruder had been clumsy, leaving clear impressions in the damp earth near the water trough. The tracks led straight to the small, empty bunkhouse where her ranch hands used to sleep before the drought forced her to let the last one go 2 months prior. She eased the door open. The room was musty, smelling of old straw and mice. The intruder had been here. A tin cup was knocked over on the floor. He had likely waited here, in the dark, watching the road, waiting for her to ride out toward the salt juniper basin. He knew her movements. More tracks led from the bunkhouse to the stable. Her mare, Cinder, nickered softly from her stall, smelling her. "Easy, girl," Sable murmured. She ran a hand down Cinder's flank, her eyes scanning the stable. The 2 pack mules were in their places. Her father's old gray gelding, half blind and retired, was munching hay. The 4th stall was empty. Stitch, a sturdy, unremarkable bay she used for errands and light hauling. He was the least spirited, the most reliable, and the slowest horse she owned. She knelt in the empty stall. The same muddy boot prints were here, mixed with the horse's shod hoof marks. The thief hadn't taken Cinder, her best mount. He hadn't taken the mules. He had taken the one horse he could catch easily and ride without trouble. She remembered what the blacksmith, Ephra Lott, had told her last month. That bay, Stitch, he's got a bad turn in his left foreleg. Drags it. I shot him to compensate. Angled the iron. But he's still a clumsy ride for anyone who ain't used to him. A novice rider, or someone who knew the horse was expendable. The tracks led out the back of the stable, not toward the main gate, but toward the east fence line, the shortest route to the town road, concealed by the creek bed. The intruder had been in a hurry to leave, but not to arrive. Sable followed the tracks, the lantern swinging, cutting a yellow circle in the deep twilight. The trail was clear. The man clumsy. He hadn't bothered to hide his path. He reached the fence, a 3-rail pine barrier. He hadn't used the gate 50 yards down. He had climbed. She saw the snag on the top rail. a fresh splinter of wood, catching the lantern light, and below it, half buried in the dust, something glinted. She knelt, setting the lantern beside her. It wasn't a coin. It was a small piece of dark metal, wedged between a rock and the fence post. She worked it free with her fingertips. It was the flat head of a spur pin, the small axle that holds the toothed rowel in place. The pin had sheared off, cheap metal failing under stress when the intruder climbed the fence. She held it in her palm. It was worn, scratched. She turned it, angling it to catch the light. 2 letters, crudely scratched but unmistakable. M.D. Sable's breath caught in her throat. M.D. Merritt Doolin, the sheriff of Dry Lantern Ridge. The sheriff himself, in her bunkhouse, in her stable, stealing her horse. He had been the one to search her office, to leave the ledger open. The law itself was twisting the rope for her neck. She closed her fist around the small piece of metal, the edges digging into her skin. The cold anger solidified into something much harder. She slept for 3 hours, fully clothed, in the chair facing the door, her Winchester across her lap. She rose before the sun, the ranch quiet, the stolen horse a stark absence. She saddled Cinder and rode hard for town, the spur pin a cold weight in her pocket. The town was just stirring. Smoke rose from the bakery and the smithy. She needed to know the rest of the trap. She tied Cinder outside the mercantile, her movements stiff. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, a voice, slick with false authority, stopped her. "Miss Hart, a moment." Sheriff Merritt Doolin blocked her path. He was a tall man who had gone to seed, his gut pushing against a uniform stained with breakfast grease and tobacco. The star on his chest was polished, but his eyes were flat and restless. "Sheriff," she said, her voice even. He unrolled a piece of paper with a flourish. "Official business, I'm afraid. Got a warrant here to search the Copperfinch." Sable kept her face a mask. She had expected this. On what grounds? "Complaint filed this morning by Mr. Horace Keeler." Doolin's thin smile appeared, a brief, unpleasant pulling of the lips. "Says he's missing 20 head of longhorn, registered to his brand. He has reason to believe." Doolin leaned in, lowering his voice. "That they might have been accidentally swept up in your last drive, misplaced onto your property. Rustling. First the rumor of arson, now a direct accusation of theft. They were building a thick file." "I haven't seen any strays, Doolin, and you've got no reason to think I have." "That's what the search is for, ain't it?" His smile twitched. "To make sure, I'll be out this afternoon. Let's say 3 o'clock. You just make sure you're there." It was not a request. It was an order, layered with a threat. He wanted her isolated, on her own land, when he sprang the rest of his trap. He adjusted his gun belt, and Sable's eyes dropped instinctively to his boots. He was wearing his spurs. The right one was dull, coated in old dust. The left spur, however, was missing its rowel. The small star wheel was gone, the arms of the spur empty. He saw her look. His smile vanished. He took a half step back, his hand dropping to his holster. 3 o'clock, Miss Hart." He turned and walked away, his stride betraying a limp she'd never noticed before. The novice rider, the clumsy climb. It had been Doolin himself. Sable watched him go, her heart pounding a heavy, cold beat. She turned to enter the mercantile, but a quiet voice from the alley beside her stopped her. "Miss Hart?" She spun, her hand on her Colt. Beckett Hale stepped out from the shadow of the overhang, his surveyor's transit case in his hand. He looked tired, his gaze direct. She did not trust him. He was a floater, a man who worked for coin, and Keeler had the most coin. "Mr. Hale, if you're here to argue about that south boundary line again, I'm busy." "I'm not," he said, his voice low. He motioned her deeper into the alley, out of sight of the street. "I was in the Mesquite Ferry yesterday when you rode past. Vetch Kincaid was holding court. Sable waited, her suspicion a tangible thing between them. "He has a warrant," Beckett said. "Nameless. For arson at Gravel Ford. The description matches your coat and your mare." This confirmed her darkest fear. A nameless warrant won't hold up. "It will when Doolin fills in the name," Beckett countered. "And that's not the worst of it. I saw Keeler's clerk, Tompkins, meet Kincaid after he paid him a deposit, $200. Sable's eyes narrowed. "A deposit for a bounty?" "A deposit for a job," Beckett clarified, his voice grim. "The rest, another $300, is due on delivery of proof. Not conviction, Miss Hart, proof. All Kincaid has to do is find or plant something that links you to that fire. And Doolin's search this afternoon sounds like the perfect opportunity." The trap was laid bare. Doolin and Kincaid, working for Keeler. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice sharp. Beckett adjusted the strap on his case, looking at the ground for a moment. "Keeler tried to hire me last week, after our disagreement about your south pasture. He wanted me to resurvey it. He was very specific. He wanted the line moved 30 yards east." 30 yards? That was nothing. "It is when it includes the Juniper Spring," Beckett said. Sable felt the air leave her lungs. The Juniper Spring was the only reliable water on the Copper Finch, the lifeblood of her herd, especially in the drought. Without it, the ranch was worthless. "I told him my measurements were accurate and I wouldn't file a false survey," Beckett finished. "He didn't appreciate it. I don't like a man who tries to buy my name, and I don't like a stacked deck." He nodded at her, a curt gesture of respect. "Doolin's not coming for cattle this afternoon. He's coming to plant Kincaid's proof. Be ready." He turned and walked away before she could reply. She stood alone in the alley, the pieces connecting with sickening speed. Doolin MD, Kincaid, Keeler, the Spring, and the telegraph, KRN 27. She ran. She didn't walk. She ran across the street, her spurs ringing, past the mercantile, straight to the post office. Nora Bell, the postmistress, was sorting a tub of mail. She looked up in surprise as Sable burst through the door. "Morning, Nora. Checking for a wire." Sable fought to catch her breath, to make her voice sound casual. "Nothing for you. Sable, you know I'd send the boy out." "No, this is different." Sable leaned on the counter, spotting the telegrapher's logbook. "I was expecting a confirmation, a code, from a supplier in Ash Mesa. Maybe it got misrouted. The code was KRN 27. Nora stopped sorting. Her friendly expression tightened. She looked at Sable, then at the logbook, then back at Sable. "That wire ain't incoming, Sable," Nora said quietly. "And it ain't from Ash Mesa." She tapped the open log. "That wire is outgoing, sent from this office. Yesterday evening, just before 6. Paid for in cash by a man I didn't recognize." "Where did it go?" Sable whispered. "To the depot at Ash Mesa," Nora said, turning the book for Sable to see. The entry was clear. Date October 14th, 1876. Sender cash. Route Ash Mesa Depot. Code KRN 27. Recipient H.K. H.K. Horace Keeler. The code wasn't a message to her. It was a signal about her. A confirmation. The trap was set. The target was home. "Thank you, Nora. It must be a different code." Sable walked out of the post office into the blinding sun. She felt dizzy, the ground unsteady beneath her. Doolin was the muscle. Kincaid was the snake, but Keeler was the head. She rode Cinder back to the ranch, the lather on the horse matching the cold sweat on her own skin. She had until 3 o'clock. She went straight to the office, to the brand ledger that Doolin had searched. If Keeler wanted her spring, this wasn't a new idea. This was an old hunger. She flipped the pages back, past her own neat entries, past her father's weakening script. She went back 6 years, 1870, the year of the first drought. There it was, an entry in her father's hand, shaky but clear. Spring, 1870. Lost 30 head, new calves, prairie fever, south pasture. The south pasture, where the juniper spring was. She pulled out the county brand registry book, tucked into the safe. She looked for new brands registered that same year. Her finger stopped. Summer, 1870. Horace Keeler. New brand registration HK, boxed. And the notation from the county clerk, initial stock of 40 head, purchased from Santa Fe, grazing at New Riverside Camp. The Riverside Camp, the same land bordering her south pasture. The land Beckett said Keeler was trying to illegally expand. He hadn't bought that stock. He had stolen it. He had built his cattle empire on her father's lost calves. And now he was coming back for the water. Sable closed the heavy ledger. The leather creaked in the silence. Her father's voice, rough as worn leather, echoed in her memory. She had been 13. Complaining about a neighbor's fence crowding their line, he had stopped, knelt, and held her chin, his eyes fierce. "In this territory, Sable," he'd said, "justice ain't a gift. It ain't something you ask for. It's something you gotta dally with your own rope. You find it, you throw your loop, and you hold tight. You let go, it runs off. You hold on. It's yours." She looked at the clock on the wall. 12:30. She had less than 3 hours until Doolin and Kincaid arrived to plant their proof. They wanted to use the law to break her. The search warrant, the arson warrant, the foreclosure. Sable picked up the broken spur pin. M, D. She thought of the telegraph. H, K. She thought of the stolen calves. She would not run. She would not wait to be arrested. They wanted to trap her, but they had forgotten one thing. This was her land. She knew every rock, every shadow, and they had just handed her the rope. She would use the very auction Keeler planned for her ruin as the stage for his, but first, she had to survive the afternoon. It was 1 o'clock. Doolin was not due until 3, giving Sable 2 precious hours. She did not wait at the ranch. She rode Cinder hard, not to the house, but to the rocky ridge overlooking her south pasture. She found Beckett Hale there, as if he had been waiting. His transit was already set up, its brass lens catching the midday sun. He was squinting at the horizon, making notes in a small ledger. He looked up as she rode up, his face calm, unreadable. "He's coming at 3, Sable said, dispensing with greetings. Her voice was low and urgent. "He's coming to plant something. The arson warrant is the stick. The stolen cattle accusation is the fist. He aims to use both." Beckett nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "I figured as much. Keeler's not a subtle man. He wants you gone by the time the foreclosure auction is called. I need a diversion." Sable said, "I need Doolin out of town. I need him now, not at 3. And I need him angry. I need him riding too fast to think." Beckett looked from her, down to the pasture below. He pointed at a series of small, bright white stakes driven into the dry earth. "Those are Keeler's false markers, the ones that try to claim the juniper spring. Doolin likely put them there himself." "If he thought you were correcting the survey line," Sable reasoned. "If he thought you were about to file a true boundary map with the land office before he could—" "He would ride." Beckett finished her thought. "He would ride hard to stop me. He can't let a true survey exist if he's planning to seize the land based on a false one." A silent understanding passed between them. Beckett began to methodically pack his delicate instruments. "He'll ride his fastest horse. He'll want his best spurs." Sable's gaze hardened. "No, his best spurs are broken. The ones he wore last night, the ones missing the pin I found. He'll be forced to wear his spares. His town set." Beckett secured the last strap on his transit case. "I'll ride down now and start pulling those white stakes. I'll make a show of it. That should get his attention." He mounted, his movements economical and sure, a cavalryman's muscle memory. "Be careful, Miss Hart. A cornered snake is the most dangerous." "So is a rancher," she replied. He gave a curt nod and rode down the slope into the open pasture. Sable moved Cinder back, deep into the juniper trees on the ridge, where she could watch the town road but not be seen. She pulled her father's old brass spyglass from her saddlebag. It took less than 30 minutes. A plume of dust rose from the town road, a single rider, moving at a reckless gallop. It was Sheriff Doolin, not on his usual plodding gelding, but on a fast black stallion. He was riding low, his face a mask of fury. He tore across the pasture, reining his horse in so hard the animal reared. He met Beckett near the creek bed. Sable raised the spyglass, her hand steady. The lens was weak, the image wavering in the heat, but she could see them. The two men were shouting. Doolin was gesturing wildly at the stakes Beckett had pulled. Beckett just stood, calm, holding his ground. Sable lowered the focus of the glass, past the men, down to Doolin's boots as he sat on the horse. He was wearing Spurs, a matched set, polished silver, with sharp, intact rowels. His spare set, the set he wore for funerals and foreclosures. She lowered the spyglass, the small, muddy, sheared-off pin in her pocket, scratched with the letters MD, was from his other pair, his working pair, the pair he used for wet, dirty work, like climbing a fence in the dark to steal a horse. She had him. Now, she needed the bounty hunter. With Doolin occupied in the pasture, Sable rode to town. The streets were quiet, caught in the afternoon lull. She skirted the sheriff's office, tying Cinder in the alley behind the feed store. The town warehouse was next to it, a large, dusty cavern of a building that held freight, spare tack, and the stored gear of men passing through. She slipped through the side door, her spurs muffled in the thick dust. The warehouse smelled of cured leather, bulk coffee, and mice. Vetch Kincaid's gear was piled in a far corner, marked by its filth, a greasy bedroll, a canvas sack, and 3 coils of rope. Sable moved like a cat. She pulled a small, tightly tied leather pouch from her shirt pocket. Inside was fine, powdered charcoal, residue from her own forge, sieved until it was as fine as flour. She knelt by Kincaid's ropes. One was new manila, stiff and yellow. One was old, frayed, and useless. The third was his favorite, a supple, grass-worn lariat, coiled neatly on top. He would use that one. Her hands were swift and sure. She uncoiled the lariat, her fingers working the black charcoal dust deep into the hemp fibers. She rubbed it in, turning the rope over and over, until the dust was invisible, settled deep within the braid. She paid special attention to the hondo in the first 20 feet, the parts a man would handle most. The charcoal was dry, odorless. It was nothing. But she knew the air at Gravel Ford, near the river, would be cold and damp tonight. Dew rose thick from the water. Dew and charcoal would make a paste as black as pitch, a stain that would not wipe clean. She recoiled the rope precisely, placing it exactly as she had found it. She was gone in less than 5 minutes, a ghost in the afternoon shadows. Night fell fast, the desert sky turning a deep, bruised purple, then black. The moon, nearly full, rose and cast a brilliant, sterile light over the mesas, making the shadows razor-sharp. Sable rode Cinder to within a mile of Gravel Ford, tethering the mare in a deep, hidden arroyo. She wrapped the reins in a piece of rag to ensure the bit could not jingle. She took her Winchester from its scabbard and proceeded on foot. Gravel Ford was a desolate place, a wide, shallow crossing on the river. The old relay station, which Kincaid claimed she had burned, was a skeletal ruin on the far bank. The station had burned 6 months ago, struck by lightning in a summer storm. Everyone knew it. But Kincaid and Keeler were counting on fear, not facts. Sable did not go to the ruins. She climbed the shallow, rocky slope that overlooked the crossing. She moved slowly, her spurs tied with cloth to mute their sound. She found a thicket of rabbit brush, its silver leaves blending perfectly with the moonlight. She settled in, the cold stock of the rifle resting on her knee. She waited. The air grew cold. She could smell the river, the scent of wet stones and damp earth. A coyote called, far off. An hour passed. Then another sound. The careful, metallic click of a shod horse stepping on gravel. A moment later, Vetch Kincaid appeared. He rode into the ford, his horse splashing, and dismounted. He tied his mount to the same burned hitching post he must have used before. He was here. He was here to retrieve the proof he had planted, or perhaps to plant it fresh for Doolin to find in the morning. Kincaid lit a torch, a bundle of pitch-soaked rags on a stick. The sudden flare of orange light made him a perfect target against the silver landscape. He was muttering to himself, annoyed, impatient. He walked around the ruins, his new charcoal-dusted rope uncoiled in his left hand. He knelt in the ashes, holding the torch low. He seemed to be looking for a specific spot. He used the rope to measure, his gloved hands sliding along its length as he marked a distance from the foundation. He stood, satisfied, and recoiled the lariat. His hands, damp from the night air and the dew on the rope, were turning black. Sable watched, unmoving. Her heart beat a slow, steady drum against her ribs. Kincaid found what he was looking for, a small, loose stone in the chimney base. He pulled it free, reached inside, and pulled out a small tin box. This was his proof. An old fuse, perhaps, or a tin of lamp oil. He pocketed it. He kicked the stone back into place and turned to leave, walking back up the slight, gravelly incline toward his horse. Sable had already seen the path he would take. It was the only clear way up the bank. While he had been busy at the ruins, she had slipped from her hiding place, silent as the moonlight. She'd taken her own lariat, weighted one end with a heavy rock, and laid the loop across the path. A simple, effective trip snare. Kincaid walked, torch held high, his mind on his pay. His boot caught the rope. He was not a graceful man. He pitched forward, a short, sharp cry torn from his throat. His body twisted, his arms flailed. The torch flew from his grasp, arcing through the dark air. It hit the wet pebbles of the ford with a loud, wet hiss. Darkness snapped shut, absolute and sudden. His heavy Colt revolver, jostled from its holster, clattered onto the rocks, sliding several feet away. Silence. There was only the sound of the river and Kincaid, on his hands and knees, gasping in the sudden blackness. The only light was the cold, indifferent moon, and it was not enough. A sound cut through the night, louder than a gunshot in the thick quiet. The metallic click of a rifle hammer being drawn to full cock. Kincaid froze. "Do not move! Vetch!" Sable's voice came from the shadow of a tall cottonwood. 10 yards away. She stepped into the moonlight, a silhouette of vengeance. The long, blue steel barrel of her Winchester was level. She walked forward, her steps silent on the gravel, until the muzzle pressed hard against the greasy buckskin covering Kincaid's neck. He could smell the clean oil on the gun. He could feel the cold, round finality of the muzzle. "Who," she whispered, her voice as cold as the river water, "wrote the nameless warrant?" Kincaid tried to laugh, but it came out as a desperate, wet choke. "Go to hell, Hart!" She pressed the barrel harder, forcing his chin up. "Who?" "It doesn't matter," he hissed, spitting onto the gravel. "It's nameless, but everyone knows who it's for sometime tomorrow. Keeler reads the foreclosure papers at the auction. And you," he sneered, his voice thick with false bravado, "you'll be sitting in the town dock, waiting for the transport train." Sable's free hand moved, quick as a snake. She felt the bulge in his vest pocket. Not the tin box of proof, something cylindrical. She pulled it out. It was a small, tin telegraph tube, capped at both ends. She didn't open it. She knew what it was. The original copy of the wire, KRN 27, the confirmation he had picked up from the Ash Mesa depot. The proof of payment, the order from Keeler himself. She tucked it deep into her own shirt. "Get up," she said. Kincaid, stunned, slowly got to his feet. She stepped back, the rifle never wavering from his chest. You ain't shooting me," he stammered, his bravado gone, replaced by confusion. "I don't need to," Sable said. "Your work here is done. Go get your gun." He hesitated, then scrambled for his fallen Colt, his eyes adjusting to the moonlight. He snatched it up, then looked at his hands, trying to wipe the gravel and damp from them. He stopped. He stared at his palms. They were black, covered in a greasy, dark stain that, when he tried to wipe it on his buckskins, only smeared, branding his clothes as well as his skin. "What?" he stammered, looking at his rope, then at his blackened hands, the realization of the trap dawning in his dull eyes. "Go on, vetch," Sable said, her voice quiet but carrying in the night air. "Go back to town. Go see Horace Keeler. Tell him you lost the wire, and make sure he sees your hands." She melted back into the shadows of the cottonwoods. Kincaid, panicked, grabbed his horse's reins and hauled himself into the saddle, casting one last terrified look at the dark woods. He spurred his horse into a frantic, clumsy gallop, disappearing back toward Dry Lantern Ridge. Sable waited until the sound of his horse faded completely. The honor trap was set. Kincaid, in his greed, had marked himself as the arsonist. The proof was, quite literally, on his hands. The ride back from Gravel Ford was a long, cold study in the moonlight. Sable felt the small, hard cylinder of the telegraph tube in her pocket, a weight that balanced the broken spur pin in her other. Kincaid was marked. Doolin was exposed. She had the proof that tied them to Keeler. But the victory felt thin. It was one battle, not the war. As she rode into the yard of the Copperfinch, the wind, which had been still, picked up. It carried a new scent, not just the alkali dust, but the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. The clear, starry sky was disappearing behind a fast-moving veil of cloud. By the time she reached the house, a fine cold rain had begun to fall. It was not a storm, but a persistent, chilling mist that felt as if it came from melting snow on the highest peaks. She saw him as she dismounted, a figure sitting in her father's chair on the porch, a single lantern burning beside him on the table, its light a small, defiant yellow in the growing dark. Beckett Hale stood as she approached, her boots heavy, her spurs making a weary sound on the wet wood. He was not wearing his hat. The fine rain beaded in his dark hair, and his coat was soaked a dark brown, almost black. The air around him seemed to carry the cold of the high country, a clean, sharp scent of wet wool and old snow. "You got back," he said. It was not a question. She nodded, pushing her wet hair back from her face, the cold duster clinging to her. "I did, Doolin." "He came apart," Beckett said, his voice quiet. "When he saw I'd pulled his false stakes, he threatened to arrest me. I just kept citing the county charter. He rode off, said he'd be back with a warrant for my arrest. He's furious, and he's rattled." "Good," she said. The word clipped. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Kincaid was fading, leaving a cold that was deeper than the rain. She shivered, a tremor that ran through her entire body. He saw it. He didn't move toward her, but gestured to the small, dark wooden box on the table beside the lantern. "I brought this for you." Sable eyed the box, then him. "I don't need, whatever that is, I need to think." "It's for tomorrow," he said, his voice firm, insistent. "It's not a gift, it's equipment." She hesitated, then stepped forward and lifted the lid. The box was old, the wood worn smooth at the corners. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, lay two items: a small hand mirror, its backing made of hammered copper, the glass surface scratched and spiderwebbed with age, but still reflective. Beside it, folded into a neat square, was a scarf. It was a deep, impossible color, a vibrant teal blue, like a mountain lake in early summer. She looked up at him, her brows furrowed in confusion. "It belonged to my mother," Beckett said, his gaze steady, meeting hers in the lantern light. "She brought it west from Ohio. She was a quiet woman, but she was strong. She wore that scarf when the world tried to push her, when the drought hit and the neighbors wanted to buy her out. When the surveyor, the one before me, told her the line was close enough, she'd put it on, and she'd go out, and she wouldn't yield. She told me she wore it." He paused. "When she needed to remember who she was." Sable said nothing. She reached into the box and lifted the small, copper-backed mirror. She held it up. The woman in the reflection was a stranger. Her face was streaked with dirt and river mud. Rain plastered her hair to her cheeks. Her eyes, usually so sharp, were shadowed with exhaustion. They were the color of limestone, hard and unyielding. She looked weathered, worn down, and desperately tired. As she stared, the hard line of her jaw seemed to soften. Just a fraction. She saw the fatigue. She saw the cost of the fight. She put the mirror down and lifted the scarf. The wool was fine, impossibly soft, the color a defiant slash against the gray night. "To remember," she whispered. She didn't use it to wipe her face. She didn't use it to clean the grime. Instead, with deliberate, steady hands, she gathered her wet hair, pulled it back from her face, and tied the scarf low on her neck. The knot firm. The vibrant blue settled against the collar of her sodden, gray-ash duster. It did not hide the dirt. It did not soften her appearance. It framed it. It was an act of defiance, a claim. "This is who I am. The mud, the fight, the exhaustion. And this color. This is my own." She was, as Beckett's mother had been, actively framing herself. "It suits you," he said quietly. She let out a breath, her gaze dropping from his, turning to the darkness beyond the porch railing. "He's not just greedy, Beckett. He's been planning this for years." "I know," he said. "There's more." He reached inside his coat and pulled out a rolled, oilcloth-wrapped map, protecting it from the fine mist. He spread it on the small patch of dry table, weighting the corners with the lantern and the wooden box. "I finished the survey after Doolin left, the real one, based on the original county markers." He traced a black ink line with his finger. "This is your property, Sable, clear and legal." Then he pointed to a series of red X's. "These are Keeler's false stakes, the ones Doolin planted. They're wrong by at least 20 yards, but that's not the trick." He tapped the map, right on the small, curling blue lines that marked the juniper spring. "The trick is here. His false line doesn't just claim the pasture land near the spring. It crosses it, right at the source." His voice dropped, thick with anger. "In the map I surveyed today, Horace Keeler's line encroaches a full yard into your water source." Sable stared at the red X's cutting across the blue ink. A single yard. A cold sweat, entirely separate from the rain, broke out on her neck. It wasn't the pasture. It was never the arson, or the stolen cattle. It was the water. The water was the heart of the ranch, the artery. Without that spring, the land was worthless. The cattle would die. The copperfinch would crumble to dust in one season. Keeler wasn't just trying to foreclose on a debt. He was trying to murder the ranch itself. "All these years," she breathed, the realization landing like a physical blow. "He's been waiting. He stole my father's calves, and now he's coming for the water." She stood up straight, pushing back from the table. The motion was sudden, jerky. Her spurs, forgotten, clanged against the wooden planks of the porch. The sound, usually so sharp and defiant, was different in the rain. It was a thin, metallic sound, fragile and sharp. It sounded like a confession. It was the sound of one person, standing alone, and she was tired. God, she was tired of being the only one. The lantern flame guttered in a gust of wind. making their shadows leap and twist. The world shrank to the small, illuminated circle of the porch, wrapped in the soft, persistent hiss of the rain. She looked at Beckett. He was watching her, his face no longer the neutral mask of the surveyor. She saw the anger on her behalf. She saw the man. In the cold air, their breaths plumed white, mingling in the space between them. He saw the shift in her, the wall of iron she wore cracking to show the exhaustion beneath. He saw her eyes, no longer limestone, but the eyes of a woman pushed to her absolute limit. And with a gesture of deep, unspoken understanding, Beckett took half a step backward. He broke the intensity of the gaze, giving her the air, giving her the choice. He did not crowd her. He would not presume. The distance, the next move, was hers. Sable looked at this man. He had warned her. He had created the diversion with Doolin. He had defended her land. And now, he was defending her space. She was so cold. The rain had soaked through her duster, through her shirt. A violent shiver racked her. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, went to the top button of her heavy, wet coat. She had to get it off. She worked the button free, her movements slow, hampered by the cold, not by any design. She fumbled with the second button, her hands shaking. He closed the distance she had not. He stepped forward, but he didn't reach for her, or for the buttons. Instead, he shucked his own heavy wool coat. It was nearly dry, the rain only beating on the surface. He didn't try to remove her wet duster. He simply draped his dry, warm coat over her shoulders, enveloping her. It was heavy, a solid, grounding weight. It smelled of him, that scent of wet wool, cedar, and old snow. He settled the coat around her, and his hands rested, warm and firm, on her shoulders. The touch was respectful, solid. It was the touch of an ally, a partner. It was a touch that said, "I am here." Sable stopped struggling with the button. The warmth and weight of his coat, of his hands, was sudden and overwhelming. She bowed her head, her forehead coming to rest for a brief, stolen moment against the dry wool of his vest. She felt the solid, steady beat of his heart through the layers. She closed her eyes. He didn't move. He just stood there, a bulwark against the cold and the night, lending his strength. Finally, she lifted her head. Her eyes met his. The vulnerability she had hidden for so long was plain, undefended. He leaned down, slowly, giving her every chance to turn her head, to pull away. She did not. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of fire or demand. It was as light as the rain misting around them. It was cool from the night air. Yet it was the warmest thing she had felt in years. It was a kiss of comfort. It was a kiss of understanding. It was chaste, yet it lasted, long enough to chase the deep, rattling chill from her bones. It was a silent promise, an answer to the lonely clang of her spurs. He pulled back, but only an inch. Their foreheads almost touched. The kiss had stopped, stopping at a boundary of shared respect, of the danger that still waited for them at sunrise. But in that small, shared space, in the mingling of their breath, an ember had been fanned. It was quiet, but it was burning. His hands slid from her shoulders. "Get inside, Sable," he said, his voice rough. "Get warm. Tomorrow is a long day." She nodded, clutching the lapels of his heavy coat around her. "The auction?" she said. "I'll be there," he replied, "with the map." He picked up his lantern and his transit case. He gave her one last look, his eyes lingering on the teal-blue scarf at her neck, then turned and walked off the porch, disappearing into the cold, cleansing dark. The morning broke sharp and cold. The rain had passed, leaving the sky over Dry Lantern Ridge a hard, brilliant blue, scoured clean of any softness. The air was thin, carrying the sounds of the town with a painful clarity, the clang of Ephra Lot's hammer on the anvil, the nervous whickering of horses, and the low, anxious murmur of the crowd. At 10 o'clock, the town assembled. They gathered, not by choice, but by a grim, shared curiosity. Under the wide awning of the town hall, this was where justice and injustice were dispensed in equal measure. Horace Keeler stood on the top step, flanked by Sheriff Merritt Doolin. Keeler was immaculate. His black suit was brushed, his boots polished, his gaze sweeping over the assembled ranchers and townsfolk with a look of feigned regret. He held a sheaf of papers. Doolin, by contrast, looked wrecked. His face was blotchy, his eyes bloodshot, and he kept shifting his weight, his hand resting on his gun belt. "If we can have your attention," Keeler began, his voice smooth and resonant. "This is a regrettable, but necessary, civic function. The Territorial Bank, which I represent, holds a note against the Copperfinch Ranch, secured by its land, water, and stock." He held up the papers. "That note, having been in default for 6 months, is now due. The bank is forced to execute this seizure and foreclosure, effective immediately. The property will be auctioned to the highest bidder." He paused, letting the finality sink in. "A sad day. Now, if we can begin the bidding." "You cannot." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a honed blade. Sablehart walked through the crowd, which parted for her as if she were a ghost. She was not the mud-streaked woman from the night before. She had washed. Her dark hair was severely braided. She wore clean trousers and a fresh shirt, and around her neck, the brilliant, defiant teal blue of Beckett's scarf. She walked with a purpose that stilled the murmuring. Her spurs were silent, her steps measured. Beckett Hale was half a step behind her, carrying his oilcloth-wrapped map. Keeler's smile tightened. "Miss Hart, this is a legal proceeding. Your presence is not required. In fact, it's irregular." "What's irregular?" Sable said, stepping onto the boardwalk to face him. "Is foreclosing on a debt that was manufactured by theft." A collective gasp went through the crowd. "That is slander, madam," Keeler snapped. "Is it?" Sable held up the heavy, leather-bound Copperfinch brand ledger. "This book holds the tally of every calf born and sold on my ranch for 20 years. It also holds the record of the 30 calves my father lost in the drought of 1870. The same drought," she added, her voice rising. "That saw Mr. Keeler register his own brand, listing an initial stock of 40 head. He bought that stock," Doolin barked, stepping forward. "He did not," a new voice said, deep and certain. Ephra Lott, the blacksmith, stepped out of the crowd. He was a massive man, his arms bare to the elbow, his face honest and grim. "I was there. I shod those animals. They weren't Santa Fe stock. They were high-country calves, thin and carrying the prairie fever. And they all bore the fresh, weeping brand of the Copperfinch, burned over with Keeler's new HK box." "You have no proof," Keeler shouted, his face turning a dull red. "But I do," Ephra said. He pointed to the ledger in Sable's hand. "The bill of sale Keeler filed with the county, the one that forms the basis of this supposed debt. The signature of the witness. It's a forgery of my name. I never signed it. My hand is steady. Mr. Keeler. That signature is a fake, and a poor one at that." The crowd erupted. "Thief!" someone yelled. "He built his bank on stolen calves." Keeler raised his hands, his composure cracking. "This is absurd. This has nothing to do with the note. The note is valid. The boundaries are clear." "Are they?" Beckett Hale stepped forward, his voice calm and precise. He laid his heavy oilcloth map on the public notice board and untied the leather straps. The map fell open with a heavy thwack. "This," Beckett said, addressing the crowd, "is the official, registered survey of the Copperfinch Ranch, based on the original territorial markers. And this," he pointed with a steel rule, "is the juniper spring." He unrolled a second, smaller map. It was the false survey, the one Keeler had filed. "And this is the map, mister. Keeler filed last week. Notice the boundary line." He traced the red X's. "It is false. It incorrectly pushes the boundary 20 yards east." "A simple dispute," Keeler argued. "A mistake by the surveyor." "It's not a mistake," Beckett said, his voice dropping. "When the line cuts directly through the water source, this map is an attempt to illegally seize the water rights, rendering the collateral worthless, forcing a default. It's fraud." The crowd surged, a low growl rising from the men. "He's stealing the water." "And who signed this false survey?" Sable asked, her voice ringing. "Who witnessed this fraudulent map and filed it with the county?" Beckett tapped the bottom of the false map. "Signed and stamped by Sheriff Merritt Doolin, dated 3 days ago." All eyes turned to the sheriff. "But here's the problem," Beckett continued, pulling the official county filing book from his satchel. "When Sheriff Doolin learned I was pulling his false stakes yesterday, he panicked. He rushed to the office to file this map and backdate it, but he was sloppy." He pointed to the stamp in the county book. "The ink, gentlemen, on the official county stamp for 3 days ago, it isn't dry." Doolin's hand dropped from his belt to his holster. He was trapped. His face was pale with rage and humiliation. Sable scanned the crowd. She saw him, lurking near the back, by the saloon steps. Vetch Kincaid. He was trying to look invisible, his hat pulled low. He kept his hands in his pockets. "And what of the arson?" Sheriff Sable called out, her voice locking Kincaid in place. "What of the nameless warrant you were so eager to fill?" She started to walk toward Kincaid. The bounty hunter took a step back. "You look nervous, Mr. Kincaid," she said. "Something on your hands." Kincaid instinctively pulled his hands from his pockets. He had scrubbed them. He had rubbed them with sand. But the charcoal, mixed with the river dew, had created a deep, greasy stain that clung to his palms and was ground deep into his fingernails. They were unmistakably black. "My God," someone whispered. "It's powder burns." "Or soot," Sable said, loud enough for all to hear. "He looks like a man who is handling a burnt torch and a dirty rope in the dark. Tell me, Mr. Kincaid, whose rope did you touch last night at Gravelford?" This was the end. Doolin saw it all collapsing, the fraud, the conspiracy, the arson. "That's enough," he roared. Drawing his revolver, he pointed it not at Sable, but at the crowd. "Disperse. This is an official proceeding." He holstered his weapon and pulled out a pair of iron handcuffs. Stalking toward Sable. "Sablehart, you are under arrest for disturbing the peace for impeding a lawful auction." He lunged for her, grabbing her arm. "Put those cuffs away, Sheriff." The voice was not loud, but it stopped Doolin cold. It was Judge Tilly Rowe. She stepped off the town hall porch, a small, gray-haired woman in a plain black dress. She was the territorial magistrate, and her word was iron. "You will not arrest a citizen, Sheriff," she said, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, "for presenting evidence in her own defense at a public hearing." "She is a criminal, Judge." Doolin sputtered, his hand still gripping Sable's arm. "She is suspected of arson, Kincaid. Kincaid has proof." "Do you?" Sable said, pulling her arm free from Doolin's grasp. She reached into her shirt, past the blue scarf. She pulled out the small, tin telegraph tube. "Or do I?" She held it high. "KR and 27, that was the code. The wire sent from this town to the Ash Mesa depot, the depot where Mr. Kincaid picks up his payments." She looked directly at Horace Keeler. "I opened it this morning. Mr. Keeler, it's a bill, a $500 charge for services rendered. Specifically," she read from the thin paper, "for the location, surveillance, and adversarial detainment of a female subject." Keeler's face, which had been red, turned the color of old paper. "This is fabrication," he whispered, his voice failing. "Forgery." "Is it?" Sable held the tin tube out to Judge Rowe. "It bears the official postal seal of the Ash Mesa Depot. Nora Bell," she called. The postmistress stepped forward, pale but resolute. "Is that your counterpart seal?" Nora looked at the wax on the tube. She nodded. "It is. Judge, it's genuine." Judge Tilly Rowe looked from the tube to Keeler. She looked at Doolin's shaking hands. She looked at Kincaid's stained palms. She stepped up onto the porch steps and slammed her small, gloved hand on the auctioneer's podium. The sound was like a gunshot. "This auction is halted," she declared. The crowd cheered. "Silence," she snapped, and they obeyed. "These foreclosure proceedings are hereby suspended. The seizure papers are sealed. I am ordering the territorial marshal from Santa Fe to conduct a full and immediate investigation into the banking practices of Mr. Horace Keeler, the conduct of Sheriff Merritt Doolin, and the activities of Mr. Vetch Kincaid." The judgment was final. Keeler stood frozen, the papers slipping from his numb fingers. Doolin, his face a mask of pure hatred, turned. He saw Kincaid trying to bolt into the saloon. Doolin grabbed him by the collar, hissing, "You thrice-damned fool," and shoved him toward the alley. Keeler, his reputation shattered in the space of 10 minutes, followed them, his posture no longer proud, but broken. The crowd erupted, surging around Sable, slapping Beckett on the back. Ephra Lott grabbed Sable's hand in his huge, calloused grip. "Your father would be proud. Miss, he'd be proud." But Sable Hart did not hear him. She was watching the 3 men disappear into the alley. She saw the look Doolin gave her over his shoulder. It was not the look of a defeated man. It was the look of a rabid wolf. They had lost their legal cover. They had lost their power in the town. She looked at Beckett, the noise of the crowd fading to a dull roar. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his face grim, his eyes on the alley. "No, it's not. They won't use paper next time." Sable clutched the teal scarf at her throat. "Tonight," she said. "They'll come tonight, and they'll come with fire." The celebration in town was a fleeting, bitter taste. By the time Sable and Beckett rode their horses back to the Copperfinch Ranch, the brief euphoria of the legal victory had evaporated. In its place, a cold, hard certainty settled. The sun was a smear of violent red across the western mesas, and the wind began to rise. It came from the Salt Juniper Basin, a high, thin wail that moaned through the canyons. It was a dry, scouring wind, the kind that carried fire. "He'll use the wind," Sable said, dismounting. Her voice was flat, stripped of all emotion save a deep, weary anger. She began uncinching her saddle, her movements economical. "They have nothing left to lose," Beckett said, his eyes scanning the ranch yard, the shadows already growing long and distorted. "Keeler's name is Mud. Doolin's badge is a worthless piece of tin. They lost the law. They'll use force." They worked without speaking, a grim, synchronized team in the fading light. The few remaining cattle were safe in the high pasture, but the horses Cinder, the old gelding, and the 2 pack mules were in the stable. "We move them," Beckett said. His voice clipped. "The Buttermilk Creek Gorge. It's deep enough to hide them, and the rock walls won't burn." It took them the better part of an hour, a frustrating battle against the wind and the skittish animals. By the time they returned to the ranch yard, night had fallen, absolute and black, save for a high, cold moon. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at their clothes and stung their eyes with dust. The ranch was silent, an empty, waiting stage. "Not the house," Sable said, nodding toward the main building. "It's a tinderbox. He'll expect us there. Not the stable. It's what he'll aim for." She pointed to the large, solid hayrick near the corral, stacked high from a better season. "There, the bales are dense. They'll stop a stray bullet, and it gives us a clear view of the feed shed and the stable. It's the only angle." They built their position quickly. stacking 2 low bales to create a protected firing line. Sable laid out her Winchester, the rifle her father had taught her to use. She checked the action, her hands sure and steady. Beside it, she lined up 3 full boxes of cartridges. Beckett, armed with his heavy, cavalry-issue Springfield rifle and a Colt revolver, took the left flank. They settled in, the rough, dry hay pricking their skin, the wind whipping their hair across their faces. The teal scarf at Sable's neck fluttered like a captured bird. The waiting was a new kind of torture. The wind was a living thing, moaning, shrieking, making every shadow leap, making every loose board on the porch rattle like a gunshot. A loose gate slammed somewhere in the distance. "Did you hear that?" Sable whispered, her eyes straining in the dark. "Just the wind." Beckett breathed, his voice close to her ear. "They'll wait. They'll wait until the moon is high. They'll want the light to see by, and the wind to do their work." 2 hours passed. Midnight. 1 in the morning. The cold was a deep, seeping thing that found its way into their bones. Then a new sound. Not the wind, the scrape of a boot on the gravel road. Sable clicked the hammer of her Winchester to full cock. The sound was tiny, lost in the gale. They came on foot, having left their horses up the road. 4 of them. Shadows detaching themselves from other shadows, moving in a low crouch. Sable recognized the greasy, lumbering bulk of Vetch Kincaid immediately. He was in the lead, carrying a heavy 5-gallon tin of kerosene. The 3 men with him were strangers, hard-faced men from the saloon, hired for Keeler's coin. "The feed shed," Beckett breathed, sighting down the barrel of his rifle. "Just like you said." "Not yet," Sable whispered, her heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. "Let them commit. Let them light the match." Kincaid and his men moved with a clumsy, arrogant haste. They thought the ranch was empty, its owner defeated and run off. Kincaid reached the feed shed, the same one Doolin had broken into, and kicked the door off its broken hinges. He began splashing the kerosene, the smell of it thick and poisonous on the wind. "A new fire," Kincaid grunted, his voice carrying clearly to his men. "New proof. This time we make sure the whole damn place burns. Find the body in the ashes," the banker said. One of his men struck a match. The small flame flared, illuminating Kincaid's twisted, grinning face. He tossed the match onto the saturated wood. The feed shed ignited with a whoosh that sucked the air from the yard. A wall of orange flame climbed the dry wood, roaring instantly in the wind, bright as day. "Now," Sable said. The shadows cast by the fire were huge, monstrous, dancing wildly. Kincaid and his men stood perfectly silhouetted against the blaze, targets in a shooting gallery. Sable took aim, not at Kincaid's chest, at his head. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked, a sharp, deafening crack that split the night. Kincaid screamed, a high, terrified sound. He grabbed his head and dropped to his knees. His hat, the one he had been wearing, flew backward. A neat, round hole punched clean through the felt crown. He was untouched, but he thought he was dead. "Ambush!" one of his men yelled, firing wildly toward the house, aiming at the wrong building. "Go!" Sable yelled at Beckett. Beckett was already moving. He vaulted the hay bales while the men were blinded by the muzzle flash and distracted by Kincaid. He was an ex-cavalryman, and this was his trade. He moved low and fast, using the long shadow of the corral fence as cover, flanking them, his boots silent in the dust. The 3 hired men panicked. They saw Kincaid screaming on the ground, and a new, dark threat appearing from the darkness to their left. One man raised his rifle, swinging it toward Beckett. Beckett did not fire. He lunged, closing the last 10 feet, using his heavy rifle as a club. The walnut stock of the Springfield connected with the man's jaw with a sickening, wet crack. The man collapsed without a sound, his own gun firing harmlessly into the dirt. The other 2 men broke. They were hired for arson. Not a fair fight. They turned and ran, scrambling back toward the gate and their horses, disappearing into the darkness. Kincaid, realizing he was alive, scrambled to his feet. He looked at the raging fire, at his downed man, at the two others fleeing. He turned and ran, a coward to his bones. Beckett stood over the unconscious man, breathing hard. The feed shed was now an inferno. "Sable!" he yelled, his voice tight. "The stable! The wind is taking the embers!" He was right. A blizzard of sparks and burning fragments was leaping from the shed, carried on the wind, landing on the dry, shingled roof of the stable. But Sableheart was not looking at the fire. She was staring at the deep, absolute darkness near the corner of the ranch house. Kincaid and his 3 men, that was 4. She had been expecting 5. Where was Doolin? A shadow detached itself from the house. Merritt Doolin. He had not come with the arsonists. He had come as the executioner, letting them draw the fire. He stepped into the flickering, hellish light, his face a mask of sweat and pure malice. He was not aiming at Sable, who was still concealed behind the hay. He was aiming at Beckett, whose back was turned as he watched the spreading fire on the stable roof. "Beckett down," Sable screamed, swinging her Winchester. Doolin was faster. He raised his revolver, his arm steady. He was taking his time. A clean shot. Sable did not have a clear shot. He was too far, the light too unsteady, Beckett too close to the line of fire. Doolin took one final step, bracing himself on the hard-packed earth to make the shot. And as his left boot, the one with the broken spur, hit the ground, the empty metal arm struck a loose pebble. It made a sound, a tiny, sharp, metallic tick. It was the only sound in a half-second of silence, louder to Sable's ears than the roaring fire. Her eyes snapped to the sound. She did not aim. She reacted. She fired from the hip, a desperate, instinctive shot at the noise. 2 shots cracked the night, almost as one. Doolin's revolver flashed. Sable's Winchester roared. Beckett cried out, a sharp gasp, stumbling forward as he clutched his cheek. A red line, a shallow graze, appeared on his skin, bright and stark in the firelight. Doolin screamed. It was not a cry of pain, but of pure rage. His gun clattered to the ground. He dropped to his knees, clutching his right hand. Sable's bullet, aimed at the tick, had not hit his chest. It had hit the steel of his revolver, shattering the grip and his hand with it. The fire was roaring now. A living beast. The stable roof was smoking, a small, greedy flame licking at the edge of the shingles. "The pump!" Sable yelled, leaping from the hay bales. "The horses are gone, but my tack is in there, my father's saddle." She ran to the stable wall. Grabbing the heavy iron handle of the hand pump that drew from the deep well, she jammed the handle down. Throwing her full weight into it, "Beckett, help me." Beckett, blood streaming from his cheek, ignored the unconscious man. He ran to the pump and put his weight on the handle. "You pump, I'll aim the trough." Sable's arms burned, but she found a rhythm. Up, down, up, down. Water gushed from the spout into the wooden trough that led to the stable's cistern. The fire was spreading. The heat was intense, the air thick with smoke and ash that stung their eyes and choked their throats. They worked, coughing, their faces black with soot, their sweat cutting clean lines through the grime. They were a team, bound by the fire and the fight, their movements perfectly in time. A few yards away, Merritt Doolin, cradling his shattered hand, tried to rise. He was spitting curses, his voice a venomous hiss in the night. "You're dead. Hart. You hear me, dead Keeler will own this valley. He'll see you hang." Beckett left the pump, grabbed a coil of rope from the corral fence, and in 3 swift, practiced motions, lashed Doolin's ankles and his one good hand to the thick hitching post. "Be quiet," he growled. They fought the fire for another 20 minutes. Just the 2 of them. A man and a woman against the inferno. The feed shed was a total loss, a glowing pile of embers, but the stable, though scorched and smoking, was saved. The roof was wet, the small fires extinguished. They collapsed against the stable wall, chests heaving. Sable looked at the wreckage. The unconscious hired man was groaning, starting to stir. Doolin was slumped against the post, silent now, glaring at them with pure hatred. Beckett walked over to where Kincaid had run. He bent and picked something up from the dust. He brought it back to Sable, holding it out. It was a large, heavy skinning knife. The moonlight glinted on the bone handle, where 2 letters had been crudely carved. V. K. He dropped it, Beckett said. More proof. Shina took the knife, her hand black with ash. She looked at Doolin, tied and defeated. She looked at the smoldering ruins of her shed. They had the henchman. They had Doolin, the crooked law. They had Kincaid, the cowardly bounty hunter. Now a fugitive. But Doolin was right about one thing. Keeler was still untouched. He was in his fine brick house in town, clean and safe. We won the battle, Beckett, she said, her voice raw from the smoke. But we haven't won the war. Keeler is still the head of the snake. He looked at her, the blood drying on his cheek. What's the plan? Doolin and his man are evidence, she said, her mind working, cold and clear. Tomorrow is the seasonal market. The whole county will be in town. They can't hide from a crowd. Sable stood up, her body aching, but her resolve like iron. We can't end this hiding in the dark. We have to drag Horace Keeler into the light, in front of everyone. The dawn came in shades of gray, a bruised, exhausted light that felt more like an end than a beginning. The wind had died, leaving the air heavy and still, thick with the acrid smell of burnt pine and wet ash. In the yard, Doolin and the unconscious hired gun were securely tied to the wheels of the heavy freight wagon. They were a problem for the town, for later. The kitchen of the Copper Finch was the only place that felt safe. The air was heavy with the ghost of the fire, but Sable had lit the stove. The smell of coffee, harsh and black, cut through the stench of the smoke. Beckett sat at the small pine table, his back rigid. The firefight was over. The adrenaline had bled away, leaving only a deep, vibrating exhaustion and the sharp, stinging pain on his cheek. Sable moved without speaking. She took a clean tin basin from the dry sink and filled it with water from the pump. She set it on the table. The water was gray with soot. She added a sliver of harsh lye soap. She dipped a clean rag into the water, her movements stiff. She came to him and stood beside his chair. "Hold still," she said. Her voice was a rasp, raw from the smoke. She touched the rag to his face. He hissed, the lye and the raw wound meeting. I said, "Hold still." She began to clean the wound. It was a shallow graze, a bloody line where Doolin's bullet had torn the skin from his cheekbone, a half-inch to the left, and he would be dead. This knowledge sat between them, a third, invisible presence in the room. Her hand was steady, her touch methodical, but as she wiped the last of the blood and soot away, he saw it, a fine tremor, deep in her muscles, a vibration she could not control. The reaction to the night, to the closeness of his death, was shaking her from the inside out. He reached up, his own hand covered in grime, and caught her wrist. His grip was not hard, but it was absolute. He stopped her. She froze, the wet rag suspended an inch from his face. Slowly, Beckett rose from the chair. He did not release her wrist. He stood, bringing her hand, still clutched in his, to his chest. He was taller than she, and she had to look up. He looked at her hand, the knuckles bruised, the nails broken and black with ash, and then at her face. Her skin was a mask of soot, her eyes red-rimmed from the smoke. The blue scarf at her neck a surreal slash of color in the grim morning light. He said nothing. He simply stepped closer and lowered his head, pressing his forehead against hers. It was an anchor, A sudden, solid point of contact in a world that had been spinning. Sable's breath hitched. She could feel the ragged, harsh rhythm of his breathing, feel the heat radiating from his skin. The tremor in her hand worsened, and she let the rag fall to the floor. They stood like that for a long time, breathing each other's air. His breath was fast, the sharp gasps of a man who had just run a hard race. Hers was the same. Slowly, in the silence of the kitchen, their breathing began to sink, to slow, to deepen. The frantic energy of the night bled out of them, replaced by a profound, shared stillness. The world, which had been the size of a raging fire and incoming bullets, shrank to the small, dark, warm space between their two foreheads. He was a bulwark. He was the first person in years who had not tried to take from her, who had not watched her with greedy, assessing eyes. He had simply stood with her. She lifted her free hand, the one that trembled, and touched the side of his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Her fingers brushed against a different kind of mark, a thin, white scar half hidden by the stubble on his chin. It was old, long-healed. "The war," he murmured, his eyes still closed. "I have them too," she whispered. She wasn't speaking of scars. His hand, the one that wasn't holding her wrist, came up. He didn't touch her face. He touched the bright teal scarf at her throat, his fingers brushing the fabric. Then the skin just above it. He traced the line of her collarbone, a streak of pale skin beneath the grime. "The land, the sun, they mark you," he said, his voice low. "But this," he touched the scarf again, "this is who you choose to be." Sable closed her eyes, leaning into the contact. His words were a balm, an acknowledgement of the fight she had waged alone for so long. She stood straight, pulling back slightly. The spell was broken, but not gone. As she moved, her spurs, still strapped to her boots, gave a small, lonely jingle on the wooden floor. The sound was a reminder. She was still Sableheart, the rider, the rancher. She was strong, but the sound, which had always been her armor, now sounded thin. She was strong, but she was leaning. She looked down at herself. She was covered in filth. The soot and ash had worked their way under her clothes, a gritty, itchy layer against her skin. "I need to wash," she said, her voice practical, though her heart was still hammering. She turned, not away from him, but to the basin. She unfastened the top buttons of her heavy wool work shirt, pulling it open. Underneath, the simple cotton chemise she wore was gray with smoke and damp with sweat. The soot had worked its way down her neck, a black stain against her collarbones. She dipped the rag into the dirty water again and wrung it out. To clean herself properly, she would have to. She reached for the top button of the chemise. The first rays of the dawn, sharp and yellow, cut through the kitchen window, striking her. The light illuminated her face, her throat, and the hand that hesitated. It illuminated her warm skin, stark white against the grime. Beckett, seeing her intention, seeing the light on her skin, turned his head. It was a sharp, rigid movement. He looked away, giving her the privacy of his back, his gaze fixed on the cold stove, a statue of respect. Sable saw the gesture. He had given her his coat in the rain. He had given her his strength with his presence. Now, he was giving her his respect. She paused, her fingers on the button. The kitchen was silent, save for the sound of Doolin coughing outside. She looked at Beckett's rigid back. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Beckett." He turned back, slowly. His eyes were not hungry, not assessing. He looked at her, at the streak of soot, at the hand on her button, and his gaze was steady. It was an acceptance. He was seeing her, the woman who had fought, the woman who was tired, the woman who was choosing. He did not wait. He closed the small distance between them. He did not touch the button. He did not touch her skin. His hands, large and rough, came up and cupped her shoulders, his thumbs resting on her collarbones, over the fabric of her chemise. He held her, his grip firm. Grounding. He turned her fully to face him, and then he kissed her. It was not the chaste, comforting kiss from the night before. This was a claiming. His mouth found hers, and it was a kiss born of fire and survival and the desperate, unspoken need that had been building since the moment he saw her ride into town. It was deep and long and absolute. It was the kiss of a man who had seen death and chosen life. Sable's hands, which had been hanging useless at her sides, came up. They did not push him away. They slid up his chest, over his shoulders, and her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. She met his kiss with a matching ferocity, a lifetime of solitude and fear and anger pouring into the single, desperate act. His hands slid from her shoulders, down her back, settling on her waist, pulling her flush against him. He held her as if she were the only solid thing on earth, his body a shield against the night they had just endured. There was no thought, only feeling. The grit of the ash on their skin, the taste of smoke and coffee, the solid, living strength of him. It was ablaze, hot and clean, burning away the last of the fear. They broke apart, breathless, but did not separate. They stayed close, foreheads resting together again. Their chests Bing! The water, he whispered, his voice thick, his lips moving against her temple. He will never. A kiss. Touch your water. The herd, she breathed back, her hand still clutching his shirt. We'll rebuild the herd. A roof, he said, his hand sliding up her back to hold her neck. A solid roof, one that doesn't leak. They were vows, whispered in the language of the high desert, not of love and forever, but of water, cattle, and shelter. The only promises that mattered. Finally, she let out a long, shuddering sigh and stepped back. The bond forged, the air cleared. She looked at him, at the clean line of his jaw, the raw graze on his cheek, the steadiness in his eyes. A small, slow smile, a thing so rare it felt foreign to her own face, touched her lips. She reached up, untied the teal scarf, shook the ash from it, and retied it, the knot firm. Tonight, she said, her voice almost clear, no longer smells of fear. Beckett's own expression softened. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. No, it doesn't. They stood for a moment. Two survivors in a wrecked kitchen, the new day waiting. After the market, he said, his voice turning practical again. After we deliver Doolin and the other one. After Keeler is finished. Yes, she said. That well pump, he said, nodding toward the window, toward the stable. The handle is loose. It needs a new brace. He looked at her, his promise clear. And that porch, it needs a proper awning to keep the rain off. Sable looked out at the well, the symbol of the fight, the heart of the copperfinch. He was not talking about carpentry. He was talking about staying. She nodded, the smile returning. Small but certain. I'd like that, she said. The high desert sun beat down on the town square, a stark, unfiltered glare that bleached the color from the festive bunting. It was the day of the seasonal market, and the square was packed. Ranchers from 50 miles around had come to trade horses, sell produce, and share news. Brightly colored pennants snapped in the same wind that, just hours before, had carried the smoke from the copperfinch. A banjo player sat on a barrel near the mercantile, strumming a cheerful, tinny tune that fought against the tension in the air. Horace Keeler was in his element. He stood on the raised platform by the town hall, the very spot where he had tried to auction Sable's life away. Today, he was a different man, the town benefactor. He was presenting a large, velvet bag of coins to the stooped, grateful pastor of the new chapel. In these trying times, Keeler's voice boomed, rich and magnanimous. It is our duty as citizens to support the pillars of our community. This modest donation, $100, is for the new roof. May it shelter all of God's children. The crowd applauded, a thin, polite sound. They were anxious, they were poor, and $100 was a fortune. Keeler smiled, basking in the brief, bought and paid for approval. He was rebuilding his narrative. The events of yesterday were a misunderstanding, a woman's hysteria. Today, he was the rock of Dry Lantern Ridge. The banjo music stopped, abruptly. The crowd, following the musician's frozen stare, turned. Sableheart was walking her horse, Cinder into the center of the square. Behind her, tethered by a long rope, stumbled Merritt Doolin, his hands bound, his face a swollen, purple mask of rage. He was followed by Beckett Hale, leading the pack mule, which was carrying the unconscious but groaning form of the hired arsonist. The town went dead silent. Sable pulled Cinder to a halt in the open space before the platform. She was still wearing the clothes from the night before, stained with ash and soot. The teal-blue scarf was a shocking banner of color at her throat. Beckett stood beside her, his face grim, the long red graze on his cheek a stark accusation. Keeler's smile froze. "Miss Hart, this is an outrage. Release the sheriff at once. This is kidnapping." "Is it, Mr. Keeler?" Sable's voice was not the raw rasp from the kitchen. It was cold, clear, and carried over the entire square. "Or is it a citizen's arrest?" She dismounted, with deliberate, measured steps. She walked to the platform. She reached into her pocket and pulled out two objects. She threw them onto the wooden planks at Keeler's feet. They landed with a clatter that echoed in the silence. First, the small, broken spur pin. "That," she announced, "is from Sheriff Merritt Doolin's boot. I found it by my fence line 2 nights ago, after he broke into my office and stole my horse. Stitch." Second, the heavy, bone-handled skinning knife. "And that," she said, "belongs to Vetch Kincaid. He dropped it last night. He dropped it when he and 3 other men, hired with your money, came to my ranch to burn it to the ground and murder me in my bed." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. "Lies," Doolin shrieked, struggling against the rope. "She's mad. She attacked us." "They came to serve a warrant," Keeler insisted, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "A warrant for arson. She burned the Gravelford station." "Did I?" Sable turned to the crowd. "Or was that just the story you paid for?" She looked past the platform. "Nora Bell, as postmistress. Can you confirm the wire I showed you?" Nora Bell, pale but resolute, stepped forward from the post office door, carrying her official ledger and her heavy brass embosser. "I can—" "Judge Rowe," she said, addressing Tilly Rowe, who was watching from the front row. "The wire, KRN27," Nora read, her voice shaking but clear, "was sent from this office and paid for in cash. It was a bill sent to the Ash Mesa Depot, confirming a $500 payment for services." She held up the telegraph slip that Sable had given her. "The services were itemized hire, hunt, and construct evidence. This wire is genuine." She slammed her heavy embosser onto a blank piece of paper, creating a sharp crack. Then she held up the seal on the telegraph tube. "The seals match. It's an order to frame Sable Hart." The crowd, which had been silent, began to move, a low, angry growl rising. "Frame her. Keeler's money." This is a misunderstanding," Keeler stammered, looking around for support. "A clerical error. It means nothing. The real issue is the land. The woman refuses to honor her boundaries." "Then let's talk about boundaries." Beckett Hale stepped forward, unrolling his heavy, oilcloth-wrapped map. He pinned it to the public notice board, covering a poster for the market. "This is the true and legal survey of the Copperfinch Ranch, filed with the territorial office in Santa Fe in 1862. He used a long steel measuring tape, pulling it from its case with a sharp, metallic zing to point at the line. "And this," he said, pulling out Keeler's false map, "is the fraud Horace Keeler filed yesterday. He claimed these white stakes." He held one up. "Mark the line. But as you can see, his line illegally encroaches on the Copperfinch property. It's theft." "It's a dispute of a few yards," Keeler shouted. "It's a matter for the courts, not the street." "It's not a few yards, Keeler," Beckett said, his voice dropping. "It's 1 yard, one specific yard." He tapped the map, his steel tape measure ringing against the board like a bell. "His line cuts 1 yard into the Juniper Spring. A man who controls the water, controls the valley." This was not a map. It was an execution. He was stealing her water to kill her ranch. The crowd surged. These were ranchers. They understood water. This was a crime worse than murder. Keeler's face turned a waxy, pale white. He saw the faces of the men in the crowd, men he had business with, men who owed him money. And for the first time, he saw hatred. He took a step back. From the back of the crowd, a figure tried to slip away. Vetch Kincaid, his hat pulled low, tried to ease into the alley beside the saloon. He didn't make it 2 steps. Going somewhere, Vetch. Ephra Lott, the blacksmith, stepped from his smithy. Blocking the alley, he was holding a 20-inch iron poker, its tip glowing a bright, shimmering cherry red from the forge. The crowd went silent. The heat from the poker shimmered in the air. Kincaid froze, his blackened hands half raised. "Now, Ephra, I ain't done nothing to you." "You're a liar and a fire starter," Ephra said, his voice a low rumble. "And you're done running." He took 1 step forward. Kincaid scrambled back into the square, his hands up, falling to his knees. Don't let him!" Kincaid screamed, his eyes wide with terror. "It wasn't just my water he wanted," Sable's voice cut through his screams. She walked to her horse and unstrapped the heavy brand ledger from the saddle. She held it up. "Horace Keeler didn't start his ranch with 40 head from Santa Fe," she called out, turning to the ranchers. "He started it with 30 calves he stole from my father. But my father wasn't the only one." She opened the book. "Jim Selby, you lost 12 head in the drought of 71. Did you not?" A weathered man in the crowd nodded. "Aye, wipe me out." "They weren't lost, Jim," Sable said. "They were found at Keeler's Riverside camp, signed for by his clerk." She turned the page. "And what about you? Abe Tensley, your 5 prize heifers that vanished. They reappeared at Keeler's ranch 2 months later, signed for by the same clerk." She held the ledger high. "He has been robbing this valley blind for a decade. He used drought and hard times to build his empire, stealing from his neighbors, from you, while he smiled and foreclosed on the very men he'd ruined." Keeler, his composure shattered, his face purple, finally broke. "She is inciting a riot!" he shrieked, his voice a thin, cracked sound. "This woman, this witch is turning you against me. She's conspiring." His words were drowned out. The crowd, the men he had just called neighbors, the men whose stolen cattle were in his ledger, surged forward. The dam of fear that Keeler had built over the town broke, and a wave of pure, cold fury washed over the square. "Thief! Liar! Get the rope!" They swarmed the platform. "Stop." Judge Tilly Rowe's voice, small but absolute, cut through the din. She stood on the platform steps, holding up her hand. "There will be no lynching," she commanded. The crowd, respecting the iron in her voice, halted, their anger simmering. "But there will be justice," she said. She turned her cold, sharp gaze on Horace Keeler, who had collapsed against the town hall door. "Horace Keeler," she declared, "I am ordering your arrest on charges of conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and cattle rustling on a territorial scale. The marshal from Santa Fe will be here by morning, and he will take you to a federal prison to await trial." She pointed to the trembling, "Bound, Sheriff. Merritt Doolin, you are stripped of your office. Your badge is forfeit. You will be tried alongside him." She finally looked at Vetch Kincaid, who was still on his knees, whimpering, "Mr. Kincaid." I'll talk," Kincaid sobbed, his blackened hands clasped as if in prayer. "It was Keeler. All of it he paid me. He paid me to set the fire. To plant the proof, he paid me to kill her. It was all him, I'll testify. Just keep that smithy away from me." It was over. The confession, public and absolute, sealed the fate of all three men. The power that Horace Keeler had held over Dry Lantern Ridge, a power built on paper and fear, had been broken by fire, iron, and the truth. The scales of the town had not just shifted, they had been smashed and remade. The roar of the crowd was a physical shock. After the silence of the high desert, the sudden explosion of sound cheers, curses, and the deep, baying cry for justice was deafening. Men were surging forward, surrounding Judge Rowe. Ephra Lott and two other men, now temporary deputies, were dragging a sputtering, defeated Merritt Doolin toward the town jail. Vetch Kincaid, sobbing, was hauled along with him. Horace Keeler, his face the color of ash, was marched between them, the velvet bag of charity money still lying forgotten on the platform. The square was a sea of chaotic celebration. Men were clapping Beckett on the back, shaking his hand, their faces bright with the savage joy of a tyrant's fall. Sable Hart stood alone on the town hall porch, the heavy brand ledger clutched in her hand. She watched the scene, the chaos, the sudden, violent shift of power, but she was not a part of it. The victory was absolute. The Copperfinch was safe. Her father's name was cleared. The water was hers. But the silence in her own head was vast. The fight, the single-minded focus that had driven her for 3 days, had vanished, and the adrenaline was draining away, leaving a hollow, echoing exhaustion. The loneliness, the deep, bone-bred solitude that had been her armor for 3 years, did not evaporate with the crowd's cheers. It was a habit too deep to break. She had won, but she was, in that moment, still entirely alone. He saw her, Beckett Hale, excusing himself from the ranchers, looked up at the porch. He saw her standing apart, a silhouette against the harsh light, still wearing the soot and the grime of the battle, the blue scarf a defiant flag. He understood. He mounted the steps, his boots making a solid, quiet sound on the planks. He stopped a few feet away from her. He did not rush in. He did not presume to touch her. Not here, not in the daylight, not in front of the entire town. He just stood, waiting, offering his presence. He had given her his coat in the rain, his strength in the fire. Now, in the victory, he gave her his stillness. Sable turned her head, her gaze leaving the swirling crowd and finding his. The raw, red graze on his cheek was a vivid reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. His eyes were steady. She saw the question in them, an offer that demanded nothing. After a long moment, she gave a single, small nod. It was barely a movement, but it was the most significant gesture she had made in her life. It was permission, it was an invitation. Beckett closed the small distance. He reached out, not for her waist or her shoulder, but for her hand, the one that was clenched tight around the ledger, the knuckles white. He gently, firmly, unfolded her fingers, taking the heavy book from her and setting it on the bench. Then he took her hand, the one that was empty, and laced his own fingers through hers. His hand was warm, calloused, and strong. It was not the desperate, fiery clasp of the kitchen, fueled by adrenaline and fear. This was a public, solid, grounding grip. It was a statement. It said, simply, "You are not alone." "The marshal from Santa Fe will be here by morning," he said, his voice low, for her alone. "Judge Rowe has already sent the wire." "I know," she whispered, her voice still rough. He looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. The work, it's just beginning. That feed shed is ash. The herd is thin. The north pasture fence is probably down after that wind. I'll manage, she said, the old defiant words coming by rote. I know you will, he said, his grip tightening just a fraction. But you shouldn't have to, not alone. He took a breath, turning to face her more fully, though he did not release her hand. I'm a surveyor, Sable. I measure land, I make maps, but I'm a rancher by blood. My father worked a claim back in Ohio until the bank, until a man like Keeler took it. He looked out at the crowd, at the jailhouse door closing. I know what this costs. I know what it takes to hold on. He turned back to her, his gaze intense, unwavering. I'm asking to partner. Not just to fix the well or the porch, I mean to partner. For the brand. Sable's breath caught. This was more than an offer of help. This was an offer of a life. I'm offering, he said, his voice steady. Half the labor, half the sweat, and, he looked her straight in the eye, half the pride. If you'll have me, if you'll allow it. I think the Copper Finch brand should be changed, just slightly. The CF is strong. It's your father's, and it's yours. But it needs something more. He used the thumb of his free hand to trace a shape on the back of hers. The CF, with a small, single line above it, like a wing. A wing. Sable looked away, toward the dusty street, her heart hammering. She thought of the first night, returning from the basin, exhausted and hunted. The only sound, the lonely, solitary clang of her spurs on the porch. A single note, sharp and isolated. She thought of this morning, riding into town, Beckett beside her, his horse matching hers, stride for stride. She thought of the kitchen, their breaths slowing together. She thought of their joined hands, a solid, warm weight in the middle of the noisy square. She moved her foot, just slightly, on the wooden planks. The spur on her boot heel jingled. Across the wood, his own spur, silent until now, answered with a soft clang as he shifted his weight. It was not one sound, it was two, a harmony, it was a new song, a duet. Yes, she said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. She turned back to him, her eyes, clear of smoke and fear, finding his yes on one condition. His expression was open. Anything. This ranch, she said, the steel returning to her voice, but tempered with a new warmth. My father's house. It was almost taken. We hold it now, but we hold it for a reason. We keep the gates open. We keep the door open. For the ones who get pushed. For the ones who come through with thin horses and no water. We will be a sanctuary. Beckett. Not just a fortress. A slow, wide smile spread across Beckett's face, reaching his eyes, erasing the last of the weariness. That's not a condition. Sable, that's the foundation. The aftermath was swift. The seasonal market, its purpose of commerce now overshadowed, turned into a different kind of gathering. It became a raising. A for a lot, his terror-inducing poker now cold, organized the men. That shed's a disgrace, he boomed, his voice silencing the square. And Keeler's bank, it's holding 3 wagons of lumber he seized from Jim Selby last month. I'd say Jim is owed that lumber. By afternoon, a train of wagons, led by Jim Selby himself, was hauling prime-cut pine from the bank's seized assets back to the Copperfinch Ranch. Men who had been strangers, men who had watched Sable with suspicion just 2 days before, now worked shoulder to shoulder in the afternoon sun. They cleared the blackened, smoking debris of the feed shed. They dug new post holes. The sound of hammers rang through the high desert. A new kind of music, a sound of rebuilding, chasing the ghosts of the fire. As the sun began to dip, painting the mesas in shades of rose and purple, Nora Bell rode out in her small pony cart. She wasn't carrying mail. She brought a heavy, rectangular piece of iron. Ephra Lot had beaten it flat that afternoon, and Nora, with her steady, artistic hand, had painted on it in stark, clean white letters. It did not say Copperfinch. It did not say heart or hail. It said, "Water is a right." Sable took the sign from her, the iron still warm from the sun. She walked, Beckett beside her, to the well that had pumped the water that had saved the stable, the well that drew life from the juniper spring. She hung the sign on the heavy crossbeam of the well. The wind, the same wind that had carried the fire, picked up, a cool evening breeze, but it felt different. It no longer felt like an enemy, a scouring, lonely force. It felt like a cleansing. It blew through the ranch yard, carrying the scent of fresh-cut pine from the new framework, and it dried the last of the damp, musty fear from the shadows. Night fell. The house was clean. The visiting ranchers had left, their promises to return with calves to help rebuild her herd still hanging in the warm air. Doolin, Keeler, and Kincaid were secure in the town jail, awaiting the morning arrival of the territorial marshal. The main room of the ranch house was quiet. A single oil lamp burned on the table, casting a warm, golden glow on the wooden walls. Sable stood by the hearth, her father's ledger now back in its proper place in the wooden safe. Beckett stood by the door, having just returned from checking on the horses, now safe in the scorched but standing stable. The tension of the day, the adrenaline, the public victory had faded. In its place was a shared, comfortable quiet. He didn't speak. He simply held out his hand. Sable walked across the room to him. She placed her hand in his. There was no music, save the chirp of crickets outside and the low, contented sigh of the wind around the chimney. He drew her close, one hand holding hers, the other resting gently, respectfully, on the small of her back. They began to move. It was not a dance, not in any formal sense. It was a slow, swaying circle in the small patch of light. They moved, shoulder to shoulder, in the quiet of the room. Two people who had fought a war and found, in the wreckage, a home. Sable leaned her head against his chest, her eyes closing. She could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart under her ear. As they turned, her spurs, still on her boots, brushed the floor, a soft silver chink. A moment later, his own spurs answered, clang, chink, clang, chink, clang. It was a new rhythm, a new song. It was the sound of partnership. It was a promise of joy, a quiet vow made in the lamplight, more binding than any word spoken in a church. The sunset bled purple and deep orange across the high spine of Ash Mesa, bathing the valley in a soft, forgiving light. The war was over, the air clean. On the porch of the Copperfinch ranch house, friends had gathered. Ephra Lot stood with his arms crossed, his massive frame relaxed for the first time in memory. Nora Bell was beside him, and Jim Selby, and two other ranchers whose land Keeler had coveted. They were the witnesses. There was no preacher, there was no Bible. In the high desert, there was only the sky, the land, and the weight of a person's given word. This was a binding, a frontier promise, stronger than any license filed in a courthouse. Beckett had spent the last hour finishing his work. The new awning over the well was complete, its fresh-cut pine smelling sharp and clean in the cool air. From the central beam, he had hung his mother's teal-blue scarf. It was not a decoration. It was a banner. It fluttered in the evening breeze, a flag of defiance, a promise of home. The door of the ranch house opened. Sable emerged. She had washed. The soot, the blood, the grime, the last physical remnants of the fight were gone. She wore a simple, clean white shirt and her dark trousers. Her hair was brushed, hanging heavy and dark down her back. She looked clean, new, and almost fragile in the soft light. She walked onto the porch, her boots heavy on the wood, her spurs, her armor, her defiant sound, gave a single, sharp clang. She stopped in the center of the porch, looking at the small gathering, at the new sign on her well, at the scarf fluttering. She looked at Beckett. Then, she performed her own ritual. She was shedding the last of her armor, the isolation she had worn like a heavy coat. Slowly, her hands steady, she reached for the top button of her clean white shirt. She undid it. The sound of her spurs, as she shifted her weight, was no longer a lonely clang. It was a beat, the first beat of a new drum. She undid the second button. It was not an act of seduction. It was an act of profound, terrifying vulnerability. It was a silent confession that she was done being a fortress. Her fingers went to the third button. Beckett moved. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes locked with hers. He did not stare at her skin. He saw her, the woman who was choosing to be open, choosing to be vulnerable, and he met her gesture with one of his own. He was holding a new dark leather jacket, supple and warm. He stepped in front of her, blocking her from the view of the world. He gently took her hands, stopping their movement, and then he raised the jacket. He did not put it on her. He draped it over her shoulders, covering her, enveloping her in the scent of new leather. His hands settled the jacket, a warm, protective weight. It was an act of defense, an act of shelter. His hands moved from the jacket collar to the blue scarf at her throat. He untied the knot she had made, and, with a touch that was infinitely gentle, he retied it himself, the knot firm, the blue tails resting over the dark leather. His fingers brushed the warm skin of her neck, a brief, sparking touch that was more intimate than any word. "Sable," he whispered, his voice rough. She looked up at him, her eyes clear, unafraid. He lowered his head. The kiss they shared on the porch was nothing like the desperate, comforting embrace in the rain, nor the fiery, breathless claiming in the kitchen. This kiss was a vow. It was deeper than the night before, slower, more certain. His hands, which had been on her shoulders, moved, one sliding up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her clean, heavy hair. Her own hands, no longer trembling, came up to grip his arms, then slid around his waist, pulling him close, holding him with a strength that matched his. Their breaths mingled, warm in the cooling air. It was a long, slow conflagration, a fire of absolute certainty, a silent promise that burned away the last vestiges of fear and solitude. It was a kiss that sealed the foundation of the house, the claim on the land, and the ownership of each other's trust. It was passionate, yet perfectly discreet, a private blaze in a public space, a promise that stopped at the edge of all they now had time to explore. From the yard, Ephra Lot let out a low, approving cheer, which was followed by a smattering of applause. When Beckett and Sable finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, their cheeks flushed in the twilight. They looked at their friends. Nora Bell, wiping a tear from her eye, smiled. "I think," she said softly, "we will leave you to the rest of the evening." One by one, the small gathering of friends nodded, mounted their horses, and rode away, their figures melting into the deep purple shadows, leaving the ranch to its new owners. Sable and Beckett stood alone on the porch, hand in hand. The quiet that settled was not empty, it was full. They walked, not to the house, but to the well, to the new sign. Beckett filled a single tin dipper with cold, clean water from the juniper spring. He held it out to her. She took it, drank deeply, and then handed it to him. He drank as well. They had shared the fight. Now they shared the water. He set the cup down and reached for her. Pulling her close, they did not kiss, they just stood, his chin resting on the top of her head, her forehead pressed against his chest. They touched their foreheads together, a final, silent seal, and in the growing dark, they both smiled. Later, by the light of the fire, Ephra's last gift was put to use. It was a branding iron, the handle long and hickory, the head forged from new steel. It was not the simple CF. It was her father's brand, with Beckett's addition a single, soaring wing above the letters. Sable took the iron from the coals, its tip glowing a dull, menacing red. She walked to the heavy timber post that held up the porch roof, the very entrance to her home. Beckett stood beside her, his hand on her back. She pressed the iron into the wood. There was a sharp hiss, a cloud of aromatic blue smoke. When she pulled it back, the new brand was seared into the house forever, the CF anchored and strong, with the wing of hope, of the future, soaring above it. "From this day," Sable said, her voice clear and strong in the night air, "this house keeps its door open for those who are forced. This water is for those who are thirsty. This is a sanctuary." "A sanctuary," Beckett echoed, his voice a low harmony with hers. "One last thing," a voice said from the darkness. Nora Bell had returned, carrying a lantern and a single, important-looking document. "Judge Rowe asked me to deliver this. The marshal took Keeler and the others this afternoon. The bank is under territorial seal." She handed the paper to Sable. It was the original note, the debt, the paper that had nearly destroyed her. Across the face of it, in Judge Rowe's severe black ink, were two words, null and void, and beside it, the heavy embossed seal of the territorial court. Nora handed her a quill pen and a small bottle of ink. "You just need to sign the acceptance, Sable, to finalize the record." Sable took the pen. She looked at the paper, the symbol of all her fear, now rendered powerless. She dipped the quill, and as she moved to sign her name, her hand began to shake. A deep, rattling tremor. Beckett put his hand over hers, steadying it. She looked at him, her eyes wide. "It's all right," he whispered. She smiled, a true, brilliant smile. She was not trembling with fear. She was trembling with happiness. She signed her name, Sable Hart, the ink clear and strong. The night was cool and deep. The house was quiet. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting warm, dancing shadows on the walls. On a thick buffalo hide spread before the fire, they lay, not sleeping, but talking. They were still fully clothed, the new leather jacket draped over them both like a shared blanket. He had his arm around her. Her head was on his shoulder. Their conversation was a low murmur, the first peaceful, simple talk they had ever shared. They spoke not of fire, or debt, or blood. They spoke of the spring, of how many calves the land could support, of the price of lumber in Santa Fe. They spoke of the future, a word that had, until now, been a luxury neither could afford. Occasionally, he would lean down and press his lips to her hair, to her temple, kisses as light and warm as the embers in the hearth. She shifted, turning, her hand coming to rest on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart, the solitude, the cold, iron-hard loneliness that had been her only companion for so long, had finally, completely, left the room. The final frame, the last light, was not the night, but the dawn. A new sun, brilliant and gold, crested the Buttermilk Creek Gorge, spilling across the ranch. It illuminated the new sign on the well. It lit the fresh-cut pine of the new feed shed, already half-built. And as the sun rose, two figures emerged from the house, walking toward the stable to greet the new day. A sound, sharp and clear in the morning air. Chink, clang, chink, clang. The sound of spurs on the hard-packed earth. Not one set, but two, a pair, walking in time, steady and warm. In the West, they had not just survived. They had found and chosen the things worth holding: the water, the land, the honor, and, finally, each other. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.